sent his son. They called him Jesus. He came to love, heal, and forgive.
The first reading is from the first letter of Peter, chapter 3, reading from verse 15 to 22, which can be found on page 1219 in the Pew Bibles. 1 Peter chapter 3, reading verses 15 to 22. But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. After being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also. Not the removal of dirt from your body, but the pledge of a clear conscience towards God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand, with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Martin, very much. Now, in our services since the beginning of January, we've been working through this letter of 1 Peter. We got to this bit here, and it may not sound like it. There's lots in that reading that might be strange and tricky. It may not sound like it, but I think that reading is talking about situations that we all find ourselves in a lot of the time. Particularly when it says in verse 17, it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. You think about what happens when maybe you have a friend at school who starts being unkind to you for no really good reason. It's not like you've said something to offend them or said you didn't start it, but they've just started being a really unkind person. What are you going to do at that point? Are you going to respond like for like and, sort of fight back and call them mean names? Or are you going to respond with love, even if they don't deserve it? Or, children, your brother or sister, particularly if you've got a big brother or sister, and they get you in trouble with your parents, because maybe they're just a little bit smarter and they know how to kind of get the blame passed on to you. I'm sure it doesn't happen in our church, but in some churches there'll be families where that happens. Terrible stuff, isn't it? What do you do at that point? When you get the blame for something you didn't do you stamp your feet and say, that's not fair, I didn't do it? Or do you absorb it and not fight back? Last week, as we were beginning to think about this passage together in church, the grown-ups, I shared a story I'd heard about a soldier who was in his barracks, and he was training, and so lots of other soldiers, and they all had their sort of bunk beds or their beds and all their stuff out. At the end of the day, each night, he would sit with his Bible open and read it and pray a bit. He was a Christian. And the guy whose bed was opposite used to hurl insults at him. Oh, what are you doing, you crazy guy, reading your Bible and praying, that's all nonsense, and so on and so on. The guy just carried on every night. One night, as he was reading his Bible and praying, the guy chucked 2 of his combat boots, his dirty, smelly combat boots, across the room and hit the Christian in the face. What would you do in that situation? That's not fair. What the soldier did, the Christian soldier did, well, the next morning, his guy across the place found his combat boots perfectly cleaned and polished up, ready for inspection. He could have responded by chucking the boots back, or worse. What he actually did was clean them up and polish them and put them back at the end of the guy's bed. That's what verse 17 is talking about. And we can think of all kinds of situations in our lives when we have an opportunity not to fight back, but to respond with love. Now, we all want to be treated like that when we do wrong. When it is our fault, when we do something wrong and get ourselves in trouble, we're desperate to be treated with mercy, aren't we? Victor Hugo, the writer of Les Miserables, said the greatest happiness of life is the conviction that we are loved. Loved for ourselves, or rather, loved in spite of ourselves. So even if I do something wrong, the best thing in life, the most sort of meaningful thing is when someone loves me, even though I'm not a very kind person. We all want to be treated like that, but we all find it very, very hard to treat others in that way. And yet that is what Peter is aiming at in this part of his letter. To do good even when you people do wrong to you. To treat people with love and care even if they're not treating you the same way. And our passage we read just now has, if you like, all the resources. Peter's bringing all the resources he can find to make us into those sorts of people more of the time. And you'll notice in the reading, it's obviously all about Jesus. It's all about Jesus Christ and who he is and what he's done. And there's stuff in this reading which is probably fairly familiar to us. So verse 18, it's a verse that lots of Christians will know and love. Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. One thing that Peter wants you just to think about is how it is that Jesus gave his life for you. The picture is of a substitution. So imagine you're playing for your school team and you're like down 5-0, but then your teacher brings on either Harry Kane or Beth Mead. And they come on and they turn the match around. I had a friend who was an ex-professional footballer who, when he went to theological college, his team was losing about 10-0, and he came on at half-time and they won 12-10. So that's the idea, that you've got a substitute. Jesus Christ comes onto the field in your place, he dies for you, and he makes it possible for you to know God. Now, I guess for lots of us here, that's familiar. And that is really important for Peter, that having Jesus as dying once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that is a way that we're going to be equipped to live these lives of giving ourselves for the sake of others. But actually, this reading goes a lot further than that. It goes into some deep and strange and important areas for us to think about. The picture that C.S. Lewis gave of Jesus dying is this one. And I really like it to help us understand a passage like this. One may think of a diver, first reducing himself to nakedness, then glancing midair, then gone with a splash, vanished, rushing down through green and warm water into black and cold water, down through increasing pressure into the death-like region of ooze and slime and old decay, then up again, back to colour and light, his lungs almost bursting, till suddenly he breaks surface again, holding in his hand the dripping, precious thing that he went down to recover. What Peter's telling us in this reading, I think, is that what Jesus did on the cross is like that diver diving to the deepest depths of what's wrong with the world, then coming back up again with us as his people who he loves. If you think about it for a second, if you just run with that image, I don't know if you've ever investigated the kind of creatures that exist underwater. There's some pretty scary ones. This is fairly deep down. It looks a bit strange. It's going to get a bit weird, I warn you. You go a bit deeper, though, and you get this thing, which if I came across that as I was swimming in the ocean, I would not be impressed. But you go a bit deeper again, you get things like that, and this has a trigger warning attached to it. Down in the depths, you've got something like that. That's very, very deep, down towards the bottom of the sea. And really what's going on in our passage, as strange as it sounds, is that Peter is talking about those kind of scary things in the reading. It's particularly verse 19 and 20. After being made alive, Jesus, he's talking about, went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. Now, there's loads of things going on here, but what you've got to think about is this is the moment after Jesus died where he's down in the depths and he's on the way up again. And as he's on the way up, he's making proclamation. He's declaring victory over some really scary things. Now, to our ears, what's going on here doesn't sound very scary, but they would have been to Peter's. I'll try and explain. The way that we think about monsters You know, as you think about monsters in fiction, there are things that you sort of hear about and you know what they're talking about already. So if I talk about someone with terrible tusks and terrible claws and terrible teeth in his terrible jaws, you know who I'm talking about, don't you? Who is it? Thank you. The Gruffalo. What if I told you about someone who has lots of scary black horses that serve him, or lives in a big and scary tower, or has a terrifying, powerful ring? Particularly grown-ups will know we're talking about Sauron in The Lord of the Rings. Here's one more for you. It's going to be, hopefully, if it works, you'll hear some sound in a second. So listen carefully to this laugh. You hear that laugh? And maybe you see some rather unpleasant facial features. And then you see they have a special wand. And you know it is, of course, if it works, it's Lord Voldemort. Now, Harry Potter fans will tell me that actually in the books he doesn't have a nose like that. That's an artistic depiction in the films. But we get the impression, don't we? There are things in our world, when we hear about them, if they're monsters, we know exactly what they're talking about. In Peter's world, when he starts talking about the things he talks about in verse 19 and 20, his readers would have thought monsters. When he talks about things like spirits who are disobedient, in prison, in the days of Noah. We haven't time to go into all the details, but for the people who first read this letter, it would be like hearing about that scary laugh, that wand, that funny nose, this guy, the scariest person ever in the world of Harry Potter. It would remind them of, gosh, there are monsters in the world. Terrible teeth, terrible claws, and so on. And what Peter is saying in this passage is that Jesus dived down to the very depths of the world where those monsters lurk. And he came up again and declared victory over all of them. That's what he was doing when he died on the cross and rose again from the dead. He was dying in your place and mine if we belong to him, but he was also defeating all the evil things that are out there. So right at the end of our reading, verse 22, talking about Jesus who has gone into heaven, is at God's right hand with angels and authorities and powers in submission to him. As he dived right to the bottom and came back up again, all the monsters, he defeated them. All those scary things, he vanquished them. He's in charge of everything in the whole universe. That's what this reading is telling us happened when Jesus died on the cross. Now, what does it mean for us? We're going to come back and think about that in just a few moments, but we're going to sing our next hymn together. It's a song about Jesus being strong, being able to defeat these monsters, and being kind, full of love for us. So let's stand and sing together, Jesus strong and kind. We have our second reading from Isaiah chapter 8, beginning at verse 12. Isaiah 8, verse 12. Do not call conspiracy everything this people calls a conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear, and do not dread it. The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So what does this story about Jesus defeating monsters in Peter's original readers' lives have to do with us? What does it mean for us? Well, I've got three things just to help us all try and understand this a bit more. There's one thing to think about. There are scary things in the world. When I was a kid, there was a book we used to read called Who's Afraid of Monsters? Which tried to sort of say, look at all these monsters. They're not scary, really. They just have bad breath or, rotting teeth, and that's why they're a bit grumpy. The book, helped me not to be afraid of things. And obviously, when we think about those monsters we were just talking about, the Gruffalo or Sauron or Voldemort, they're not real. There are so many things in the world that aren't real that we just don't need to be scared of because they're not real. But it's really interesting that Peter, that's not quite what he says when he talks to these people about these monsters that they knew about, the things that made them scared. He doesn't say they're not real. He says they are real. He talks about them as real things. Grown-ups might be feeling like the world is a scarier place than it's been for a long, long time. And when we have those sort of feelings of fear and anxiety for the future bubbling up, we might want to just bury them. Oh, no, don't you think about that? That's not what Peter does with his readers here. He talks about those scary things for them. We don't quite feel it, do we? Because they're not scary things for us. I don't read verse 19 and 20 and go, that's scary. But his readers would have done. There are scary things in the world, things that we can't control, things that are beyond us, things that keep us up at night, that aren't fake, they're real things. And yet at the same time, Peter wants us to see, though there are scary things in the world, Jesus has totally defeated them. That's what Peter wants his readers to think about. That Jesus has dived down to the depths of the world, to wherever those scary things are, and he has declared his victory over them. He gave his life on the cross to defeat the biggest and scariest and most terrifying monsters you can think of. Later on in the letter, we're going to come to it, I think, in our next all-age service, actually, Peter talks about the devil, who is the realest and scariest of all the enemies of God. He calls the devil at that point a roaring lion. Now, if you were out on safari and you came across a lion roaring, what would you do? You'd run away as fast as you can. If you had a car, you'd jump in it and you'd drive, because lions are terrifying. Do you know what Peter tells his readers to do? I'll read the verse. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. That's really bad. Resist him, standing firm in the faith. Peter doesn't say to run away from the devil. He says, resist him. And I think it's really important, we'll think about it next all-age service, that the devil is a roaring lion here. He looks terrifying, but he's just got a roar. He hasn't got a bite anymore, because Jesus has defeated him. That's what Peter wants his readers to think about Jesus Christ. Those scary things in the world that aren't pretend, that are real, Jesus is more powerful than them, and he has defeated them for good. That doesn't mean that they won't scare you still, that they don't have power to sort of make you shrink back. But Jesus is more powerful. He has gone into heaven, is at God's right hand, with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. And that means, thirdly and finally, we don't need to be afraid anymore. That's where this reading, I think, ends up. That we can look at those things that do make us afraid, and we can say to them, because Jesus is more powerful, I don't need to be afraid of you anymore. It's not easy. It wouldn't be easy, would it, to look at a roaring lion and say, I'm not afraid of you. And if you were to do that in the wild, it would go very, very badly for you. But with the monsters in our lives, it really is the case that we can look at them and say, Jesus is more powerful. And that's why, in the end, you can live those lives of service and love towards others. Because you don't need to be afraid of people, taking your life from you. You can give it willingly. You can spend your whole life in serving others. Those monsters aren't going to harm you ultimately. And so you can listen to Jesus and do what he calls you to do and follow in his footsteps. Even when it costs you, even when it's hard to do that. You think about that person at school that you find it hard to treat with love, or when you get the blame for things you didn't do, or when at work you have those opportunities to live a life of love or live a life of self-serving. Whatever it is, Peter uses the strongest thing he can come up with. Jesus is more powerful than all the scary things in the world, and he calls you to follow him in living a life of love, not of fear. That's a really hard thing for us to hear. It's a really hard thing for us to put into practice. I think given the week that the world has had, it's particularly important for us to hear this call from Peter. It's why I'm going